Hello everybody, my name's Alan. I'm your presenter for this taster session for Adobe Animate, and the latest release is a wonderful release. It's got some great new features for helping us do character animation, so we'll have a bit of fun with that. As has just been mentioned, everything has been recorded or will be recorded, so you can watch at a later point. Press the pause button. I would fully recommend you relax now and just watch this and absorb it. It's going to be too much to do to try and go alongside me. Just be mindful, if you're going to grab some images yourself off the internet, copyright issues, so just by all means grab images for your own purposes, playing about. I do this all the time, but of course you need to make your own graphics up if you're going to distribute stuff. The end result that we're going to be putting together is going to be a combination of HTML5 and Java content, albeit through Animate's wonderful graphic editor, or maybe MP4 video for social media or infographics. I'll just quickly show you what we're going to be putting together. So the first thing I propose is maybe putting together some kind of an advert for a product to show the different types of tweening. So this is an imaginary product for sunscreen. And you see that I've got my character walking across at the end. I've got my plane flying over to show that type of tween. With the clouds, I've got a little bit of 3D depth there, so the smaller ones are traveling slower. And I'll just run it again so you can see that the sun was rising initially, and now it was turning to day. The palm trees moving around. We're using a new feature called Asset Warp for that. And I've got some motion presets we can look at. Adobe Animate has a rich variety of these already pre-built into the software. And once we've done that, time might be getting away from us a little bit, so I'll have to cut a few corners to get to the most interesting points. But here's an infographic that we're all sadly familiar with, which is, COVID related. And I've just added these characters to kind of indicate social distancing to make it a little bit more intriguing. So I'll just demonstrate maybe how the other stuff's been put together, but we'll focus on the characters. Listen, I hope you enjoy this. I'm about to get going. I've had tremendous fun putting it together, and I hope really to entice you to really get busy with this software and put some wonderful things together yourself. So here we go. I'm going to first of all indicate that I like to put my general graphics together in either Photoshop and Illustrator, one or the other or both. And in this instance, I've got my plane on a separate layer, logo, palm tree, bucket and spade, albeit they could be on one layer, and the beach background. So observe the layer names. When I bring this into Animate, all of that's going to be respected. I'll just minimize that for the time being. That was just to demonstrate how I've laid that out. Just one more thing actually in there. There is another Photoshop document that goes alongside this that's got the beach or at least the ocean a bit bigger. You can barely tell on that, but it's about 15% bigger in size, and that's because I want to show you a neat trick how we can make this sort of ripply effect for the water. So without further ado, let's have a bit of fun. I'm going to go into Animate and load it up, and again I'm going to be going at a fair old pace here. I've got quite a lot to go through, so I'm going to create a new document on the left hand side. And I'm going to choose this category along the top. This is called Intent. I'm going to Web, and I'm going to click on the size for 640 by 480 for no other reason than that's the size that I've created my graphics in Photoshop. And I'm going to press Create, which is fine. And then the first thing I'm going to do is I've got a default layer here. You always get that. That's got one frame that's empty. There's nothing on it. I've clicked on that frame, and I'm going to go to File, and I'm going to choose Import to Stage. The stage being this big white area, often referred to as the canvas as well. So I'm over into my folder where I've got those two Photoshop files that I showed you a few moments ago, and I'm going to bring in the beach first of all. That was the one that had the multiple layers, and it opens up after a moment in this dialog box. And the clever thing about this dialog box is not only does it display the Photoshop layers, it allows me to turn on this checkbox that converts them into a movie clip. Now that does not mean video footage. That really means that we can make the whole thing interactive, and also we can apply tweens, which of course is going to be in our instance mainly motion. So I've clicked on each one of those layers and done that. Just like to go through them again. Don't need to supply names for these, it will absorb the names from the layers. I'm going to press import. So there we go, we've got all our graphics and it fits our working area nicely. Now the first thing I want to do is put a sky background. Now it's quite good, this software, because it's got some features to help you create artwork, and do bear in mind it's all vector graphics, so it looks like you're working with pixels at times the way it behaves, but it really is vectors, more like Illustrator than Photoshop. So I've got all my layers, you can see what's happened there, they've all been drawn through from Photoshop. The bottom layer that I originally had, I'm going to double click on that and change its name to Sky. Click on the black or the empty keyframe, and all these other layers can just drag down where the padlock column is, so don't accidentally work on those. Over to the tool panel, and I've got this rectangle tool here, and bizarrely I'm just going to click and drag a rectangle any size, any color. If you know other Adobe software, then you'll know that typically where you see the black arrow, that's a selection tool. So I'm over in the tool panel here. I'm going to click on this. And then on the right hand side of my screen, I've got my align panel. And the great thing about the align panel is so long as you've got this checkbox on align to stage, you've got this match size column here. So you can just click on the third button and it makes the size of the rectangle match the size of the working area. I can align it to the left and the top, so that's good. And then the next thing I'm going to do is put a gradient in, so it's a nice sort of sky blue coming down to a white at the bottom. So just below the align panel, we've got the color panel. I'm going to click and choose linear gradient. On the left hand side, I've got my black gradient stop going to white. I'm going to leave white. I'll double click on the black and choose this lovely blue. So clearly the gradient needs spinning around. Well, over in your tool panel again, where this tool is next to the selection tool, I can right click and choose the gradient transform tool. And what happens is you get a circle in the top right hand corner that you can use to rotate the gradient like that, which is pretty good. And maybe just pull in the height of it and get the center point and push that up as well. That looks nice. So I'm going to lock that layer now. And the next challenge that I want to move on to is the plane. So for the first time, we'll see some motion. So what's going to happen is, remember, we've locked some of these layers, so I'll unlock the plane layer and I'll work on each of these layers one at a time. I'm going to click on the plane. And the first thing I'm going to do is pull it off the stage, the working area. And I'll remind you that when we imported all of this, each of these layers was converted to a movie clip. And it tells you that in this panel on the left-hand side called the Properties panel. I'm going to make it so that the plane goes quite a lot smaller. So over to the free transform tool, which is where the gradient transform was a few moments ago. And just click and make it smaller with the shift key held down, which is good. Now, you can see clearly we've got along the top a timeline, and we've got frame numbers, and we've got above the frame numbers how many seconds we're up to. Now, what I've got in mind for this particular project is for everything that we've already converted to a movie clip to be animated inside its own timeline. Now we do that by double clicking. So if I double click, I'm inside the plane's timeline. So you can see scene one plane, just got one layer. And it's dead easy from here on in. I need to convert it to a movie clip again so that I can animate it. I do that by going to the modify menu and choosing convert to symbol. And I've got this method, I tend to call it inner, and then whatever the name, the initial symbol was. So plane, and press OK. So I'm now going to say I want some tweening, which is insert, create motion tween. And it always gives you this 1 second of timeline footage by default. And you've got this blue playhead that you can use to kind of span across, but we've got no motion at the moment. And what I really want to do is tween the plane, say over 4 seconds, and then have some kind of a pause, maybe 3 seconds, and then let the motion run again. And I'll remind you, we're inside the timeline just for the plane here. So I'm going to drag this out, like I just said, to 3 seconds, maybe 4. There's the 4 second mark. I'm going to pull the plane over to the left-hand side, and it builds what's called a property keyframe, which is like a tiny black diamond there. So it's stored this new change, this property change for the location. It'll also store if you make changes to the width and the height. So I'm going over to the free transform tool, and I'm going to shift drag and make it quite a bit bigger, like that, move it around. So you can see we've got this sort of effect, which is good. If I click on the layer name, it highlights all of the timeline bar. And in the properties panel, I can do this easing effect, which means it doesn't have to play at a constant rate. I can make it so that it's quite slow to look at in the distance, and as it gets closer to us, it picks up pace, which is, of course, in the real world, what you tend to see. So if I do -100, that's exactly what that will be. Starts slow, picks up speed. You could do the opposite by having positive values to ease out. Now I'm going to do this to the minus, as it should be. And then, so I've got that. And then the only thing to know about this, this software is timelines loop by default. So that will continually do that. And it's going to be a bit of an overkill for whoever's viewing this advert. So we need some kind of a delay before it loops. So I'm going to go over to the 7 second mark. And I'm just going to say insert timeline keyframe, and that will store it at this location from this keyframe to from the previous one. So we can see that we're going to get this lovely delay. Just maybe, it's going slightly right. I'll just maybe go to that keyframe and just move it over like that. I'll just undo that last step actually. Just do a series of undos. And I'll do it in a slightly different way. I'll go over to the 7 second mark and I'll say insert timeline frame rather than keyframe. That's better. So rather than trying to do another tween between 2 points, I've got the start point, the end point's going to be over here. And again, just pushing that there. You know it. Let me just undo this and go again. It's not playing ball. So I'll just do a series of undos. I'll do this as quick as possible. I've got quite a lot to cover, so just make sure that we've got all that in place like that. Then I'll go over and add the additional frames. That looks better. And then at this point, I'll make it bigger. So yeah, just kind of missed a step there. I'm sure you can appreciate during a presentation, things can go slightly awry, but there we go. That's exactly what I want. So at frame 1, all the way up to 4 seconds, increases in size, right to the end there. So that's pretty good. Got there in the end, just put the easing on. And slightly too far back. So I'll return to scene 1. And the next thing I want to do is have the sun coming up from behind the ocean into the sky. I'm going to lock this layer. We've got no layer for the sun. So I'm going to build a new layer here. I'm going to click on the empty keyframe. And I'm going to go over to where the geometric shape tools are in the tool panel here and right click and choose the oval tool. Before I start drawing, again, in the color panel, I've got my gradient here. So I'm going to go and double click on the blue and choose an orange. And then we kind of know what's coming next. Going over to the transform tools and choose the gradient transform. So I can just swing that around So it's white at the top and orange at the bottom. So I've got that sort of thing. And I'll call the layer Sun. And again, this is artwork now that I created in this software, and I want to tween it. So I need to go to Modify, Convert to Symbol and give it a name. And this is akin to when we imported the Photoshop artwork before. In that dialog box, turned on that checkbox. So I've got that, got the sun in place. And it is going to start out live here behind the ocean. I'll move the layer down in a few moments. It's easy to access like this. And I'm going to double click on it and I get to see the original artwork that I've just drawn in its own timeline. We'll say Modify, Convert to Symbol and call it Inner Sun. Again. And I'm going to say Insert, Create Motion Tween. And I'm going to tween this over 5 seconds. Let's see if we have a bit more joy this time. So get hold of the instance of the symbol, move it up into position, and we've got this. Yep, that's fine. Perfect. That's how things should be. And you'll notice there's a blue line that's appeared between the starting pose and the end pose. It's called a motion guide. You can click and drag it to curve it, so it doesn't need to follow a straight line, which is pretty good. And then the only thing is, I'll remind you, a few moments ago, I did say that these timelines loop by default. Well, I don't want this to loop. That's going to be annoying. I want it to stop on this occasion. So when you've got the player at the end of the timeline, I go over to the window menu, and it's a little bit of code, unfortunately. Not many people enjoy coding, but we have code snippets to help us. So in other words, it's going to print the code for us. I'll expand HTML5 canvas, timeline navigation, and then I want stop at this frame. So when I double click on it, watch what happens. It builds a new layer called actions, and it's put at the end a keyframe, a little A there. So keyframes when something happens. And in this instance, we just printed a little stop action. If I click on that, you can see the code in here. Always brings up this actions panel. We can close it off more or less straight away. And I'll close up the code snippets. And I'll return to scene 1. So I want the sun to be below the ocean. So you can just drag the layers down like you would do in any other Adobe software. And if you want to see a kind of a preview of where you're up to at any point, you can just do Command Return on a Mac or Control Return on PC. So we can see that's beginning to work. The playing gets a bit quicker as it gets closer to us. Yeah, it's coming together nicely. So we need a new challenge now. We've done the sun and the plane there. So we'll now have a look at how we can do the clouds that are going to be in 3D space. So the smaller ones are going to travel slower than the bigger ones. And again, I'm going to be a little bit quick here because time's going to get away from us before you know it. So I'm going to build a new layer. I'm going to click on the empty keyframe, and we'll call the layer Clouds. And then I'm going to go over to the ellipse tool and go over to the properties panel and just change the fill to white. I'm just going to draw a series of overlapping ovals here. Give me cloud, that'll do. I'll click on it. I'm going to go over to the color panel again on the right hand side of the screen. I'm over here now, just changing the color to be a linear gradient again, and maybe just on the left hand side a soft gray. Over to the gradient transform tool, and like we did before, just swinging that around. I'm only doing this because we're going to have some overlapping clouds, so we don't want to see like a mass of white objects if they overlap, so that should help it. So I'll click on that now, Modify, Convert to Symbol, and Cloud. And then I'm going to double click on it. So I've entered its timeline. And again, I want to tween it. This is the bit that people struggle to grasp most of all. You need to be inside the timeline. And if you want to tween it inside its timeline, it must be a symbol again, an instance of a symbol. So we say Modify, Convert to Symbol. You can tell it's selected. It shows us half-tone dot. So Modify, Convert to Symbol, and again, Inner Cloud, which is fine. I'm going to say Insert, Create Motion Tween. So get me default 1 second's worth of timeline bar. And I want to drag that out to about 500 frames so it travels nice and slow. Which is good, there or thereabouts. And when I click on it, I want it to move a long distance. So rather than dragging it way off into this pasteboard area, in the properties panel, I'm going to enter an X value. So I'm going to enter 2000 pixels in there and press return. And there you go, it's put a property keyframe there. So this is going rather well since we had that initial glitch with the plane. Not too bad, looking good. So back over to scene 1. And then the great thing about all of this is when you make these symbols, in this library panel, I've got this usage column that lets me know how many I've got, which is to say instances of them. So if I was to Alt drag, just like any other Adobe software, you can make multiple copies. And if I was to go over to the normal transform tool, I can scale the ones that are meant to be in the background to be a little bit smaller. It's been a little bit random about this. That one can be a bit bigger, allowing them to overlap. And the great thing about scaling them down, it affects the speed in which you play. So they're going to go slower and the bigger ones are going to go faster. So when they overlap, it gives you this lovely illusion of 3D space. I do need to predict that I'm going to need some over here to move into the canvas area. So I'm going to shift click and Alt drag. So I've got some copies there, and I'll do another Alt drag as well. So I think the only other thing really is worthwhile doing is just maybe shift clicking on the larger ones to select just those and say modify, arrange, bring to front, which is good. So this is all looking good. And again, if we just do a quick command return, we can see how this is all shaping up. Yeah, those clouds are beginning to overlap, the ones that are larger in the foreground. So it's all looking good. And again, we need a new challenge. So I'm going to lock the clouds layer. And I think what we'll do now is work on the logo and see if we can animate that. So I'm going to unlock the logo layer. And again, when I click on it, it's an instance of a symbol because we did that in the import dialog box to begin with. I'm going to double click on the logo. And again, when I look at it here, I'm just seeing the bitmap. So in order to animate it, I must convert it to a symbol. So I'm going to call it inner logo. I'm going to copy this, edit copy, but I'm not going to paste just yet. You'll see why shortly. Now, in this instance, I want to show you that the software ships with some motion presets, which means it will do the work for us. So I'm coming down from the window menu to the panel for motion presets. And I'm going to extend the default presets. There is one below it that indicates you could store your own, but we'll not go that far into it today. So the default presets, scrolling down, and I'm going to go to this pulse preset. Gives you a bit of a preview what it might do to an example graphic in the main window at the top of the panel. And I'm going to press apply to that. So you can see what it's done. It's built this timeline bar with multiple property keyframes for the pulse preset. Not bad. I'm going to click on the frame that's empty at the end of it and say insert timeline blank keyframe so I can go again. And now you know why in a few moments ago rather, I'd copied it because I can now go to edit paste in place and then I can press the pulse effect again. So I've got 2 pulse effects, that's better. And then I just want to have a pause at the end. I think it's going to be too much of a information overkill for that continually to loop. So I'm going to create another blank keyframe and another paste in place. And then I want to have some static frames. This is what I tried to show you earlier. To add static frames that don't animate, I'll go to say the 7-second mark to cause a nice delay here. So just scrolling over to the 7-second mark. So static frame show up in gray, insert timeline frame, which is well worth remembering the shortcut as F5. So I'm going to allow this to loop. The idea is that from 2 seconds to 7 seconds, we get that 5-second delay before this logo does that again. We'll see all that shortly. I'll go back to the root timeline. And again, if I If you didn't pick up on that before, you're double clicking to get inside internal timelines and using what's called this breadcrumb option to go back up to the root timeline where it says scene 1, which is pretty good. So I'm going to lock that. And again, we'll just do a quick preview at this stage, see where we're going with this. Yeah, it's beginning to come together nicely. I'll close that off. And again, we need a new challenge. So what I'm going to do now is just show you the clever trick where we try and make the beach, or at least the ocean, ripple. Well, here is the actual ocean itself here on this layer called beach. All I like to do is turn the eye on and off to see, get your bearings. And what we do is going to be above this layer. So that layer is going to stay the same. And I just need to bring a layer in, which is going to go to the top of the layer structure no matter what. So I may as well live with that and just click on the topmost layer. I'll just unlock that so we can bring something in on top of it. Import to stage like we did earlier. And of course, it's this ocean bigger that I showed you in Photoshop. And again, I'm going to convert it to a movie clip. So it brings it in. So that's just about, like I said, about 115, 120% bigger than the ocean below it. And I'll just lock that clouds layer again, and I'll drag it down to where it belongs. So of course, it's going to be above this beach layer. And then I'm going to double click on it to go inside its timeline. And I'm going to make a new layer above it, which is going to be for some ripples. And bear with me on this because it might seem odd to begin with, but what I'm about to do is going to end up being a mask, which is going to dictate what pixels show on the layer below it, which of course is this increased size. So I'm going over to my paintbrush tool. I'm going to go over to the fill, and I'm going to choose a yellow color. And I'm just going to create some random lines indicating the roughness of the ocean, particularly where the white bits are. And of course, time is not on my side here, so I'm going to be a little bit loose about this in places. I'd normally spend a good 10 minutes on this. And you could always use the eraser tool to kind of cut bits away, so it's more of a sort of, if you like, a rough effect, a jagged effect, or chamfered in places. But like I say, I'm not going to get too carried away with that because we simply don't have the time. I'm going to lock the bottom layer so that I don't interfere with the bitmap below it. And on this occasion, it doesn't need converting to a movie clip, the bottom layer. I'm going to swipe over all of my yellow shapes and then Alt drag to have a copy and a third copy. And then I'll select the lot and say modify convert to symbol for these ripples. So the idea is if we say insert create motion tween for the ripples and maybe pull that out to say 4 seconds, if I spot where I've got the top right hand shape and drag it down to where it overlaps the original, which is here, I've got a ghosted preview of the original. So of course all timelines loop by default. We just need to make it so the bottom layer's got enough frames to display for this. So I'll click at the end frame for the bottom layer and say insert timeline frame. And then the magic comes in when we right click on the ripples layer name and say mask. So what's going to happen now is that's going to do this, but of course on the root timeline, all the other colors come back to full strength. So the effect looks quite impressive. Again, I would spend a bit longer ordinarily, but you can see we're getting that sort of lovely ripple effect. So that's not too bad. We can now do the palm tree, and this is more of a modern effect. So I'm going to go over to the palm tree layer, which is of course this palm one, and just unlock it, click on that, and double click to go inside its timeline. And again, it's a bitmap, but it needs to stay as a bitmap on this occasion because I just want it to kind of gently move in a subtle breeze, the wind. So we've got this modern tool, which is called the asset warp. If you're familiar with puppet warping in either Photoshop or Illustrator, it's the same concept. You click across your graphic maybe 3 times on this occasion, and those points then become pins, so you can drag them around and warp the graphic. I'm going to add another keyframe at 1 second, I've got to do it this way, insert timeline keyframe, which is slightly different from how we did previous motion, because what I'm trying to achieve, which is the motion of different poses, it's only supported with an old way of tweening called classic tween. So I'm going to have another keyframe at 2 seconds. So 2 seconds, and there's the starting point, I'm going to look exactly the same, and at the 1 second mark, I'm going to change it. So I'll just come over and maybe just click and drag. Maybe just get a little bit of the curvature of the leaves there. So of course, you need tweening, otherwise you're just going to get those 3 poses, that's all you're going to get. So tweening, the word tween is short for in between. So the software is going to do the in between for us. I click on the first keyframe and say insert create classic tween. Goes purple, which indicates the old way of tweening. Click on this keyframe, insert classic tween. So it's got to be classic tween in order to use this puppet warp option, or the asset warp, if you will, and it gives us that. Pretty good. Back to scene 1. We'll lock that, and we'll just again take a quick check on how this is coming together. It's doing rather well. It was only that initial attempt at doing the plane that went wrong, but that's fine. You just kind of backtrack and go again with it. Can happen. So now I want to have the lady walking across the beach. So I like to do some of these things in a separate file. And you're going to see now why I favor working in this manner, where the root timeline, this scene 1 root timeline, just has 1 frame in it. You don't have to work in this way. And indeed, we'll see with a later project that you can work across the root timeline if you want. But this is called the modular approach. You can click on any one thing and copy it and paste it elsewhere, and you've got the full animation for that object. So let's see it now with the woman walking across the scene. I'm going to go to File New. I'm just going to press Create to any size. I'll close off this Motion Presets panel. And I'm going to go over to this Assets panel on the right-hand side. And this is all new with this latest release of the software. And I've got 3 categories here. I'm not interested in sound effects, but static gives me these characters that Adobe have shipped with the software. And I'm going to pull out this one on the bottom right, which is called Beach Girl. There she is. Not too bothered about the fact she's way too big for my working area. She's not going to stay in this file. I'm going to collapse that category and expand the animated category, and then I've got a rig for her that makes a walk. The only thing I do need to do, it's just the way it's set up. Again, just like we did our constructions, our various graphics, we had to double click to get inside where all the elements are. Same with this. If I double click, that's where all the individual elements are. So it's got its own internal timeline. At this point, I can go to the rig and just drag it over, and we get that. It's moving. You can do your own. We'll see that hopefully later. Again, I'm glancing at the clock here, and even now time's getting away from us a little bit. So I'm going back to scene 1. I'm going to click and copy that, and its internal motion will come over with it, which is this modular approach I just mentioned. I'll create a new layer at the top, but it will need moving, and I'll call it Lady. Click on the keyframe and paste. Scale her right down. The shift key there. Maybe just have a slightly bigger than the logo, but not as tall as the tree. Something like that. And move it there. And then we've got a little bit of a problem. This is where, if it doesn't quite make sense, these internal timelines, I'm hoping that this helps. So when I double click on this, she's just walking on the spot. And I don't want that. I want her to walk across from right to left. So in order to achieve that, and do bear in mind what I just did, if I double click, I'm just seeing this internal timeline where she's walking on the spot. So on the root timeline, if I convert her to a symbol again, and this time I'm going to call it outer lady, then we're now looking at an instance of outer lady on this root timeline. And if I double click on it, I now see the symbol that we saw a few moments ago. And then if I double clicked again, you'd see the walking motion. So you've got a 3-tiered approach now. I'm just going to jump up to the middle level. And this is where I can add my motion tween. Insert, create motion tween. So I'm going to make it so that she starts at, say, maybe 3 seconds. So I'm just dragging the timeline bar, so not everything has to start animating from the start. And then I'm going to pull that out to 9 seconds. And I'll pull her over to the left-hand side of the screen. And I don't mind it looping because we've got this delay then of these first 3 seconds, and then it just keeps moving across. Back to scene 1. And I'll just quickly do the trick where we do Command or Control return to see how this is all building up nicely. Yeah, we're beginning to get there now. So the woman walks in, pretty good. Clearly needs to have the layer order changing. So I think I'll just go over to the timeline and have it so that she appears between the bucket and spade and palm tree. So it's as simple as dragging it down below the palm tree above the bucket. We'll see that the next time I run a preview update. So the final thing I want to do with the animation side of this is make it so when, of course, when the sun's down, it should be quite dark. The sun comes up and it lightens. So I'm going to add one more layer at the top and call it night to day. You can't have spaces in these layer names. And again, I'm going to go over to my rectangle tool, perhaps choose a black color. Do that. And in the same way, at the start of this session, I showed you, you can go over to the align panel and match the size. Left align, top aligned. Modify, convert to symbol, night. Double click on it because we want to animate it in its own timeline. Modify, convert to symbol because I'm looking at graphics, inner, night. And then I'm going to say insert, create motion tween, and I'll make this occur over 5 seconds because that's how long the sun took to rise. So back on the first frame, I'm going to click, and then to make it so it's kind of semi-transparent, what you might call opacity in other Adobe software is called alpha in this software. So in the properties panel, we've got color effects. I'm on the left-hand side here. There's alpha. I'm going to take that to about maybe 80%. You can always tinker with that. And then on the right-hand side, get the playhead all the way over to the 5 second mark and take that down to 0. So we get this sort of effect. And again, that's going to loop by default. And when we did the sun, we added a stop action at the end, so it stopped it from looping. So long as your playhead's right at the end there, we can go to window and we can come down to code snippets, expand HTML5 canvas and double click on stop at this frame. So we're in good form with that. Close these panels up, don't need them again. So that whole thing looks like this. I'm going to save it on my desktop as in a project folder. So I'll just call it project 1 and beach. And when I go to the file menu and choose publish, it builds the files that are necessary for it to be part of a website. Go over to it, find my project folder, which is going to be behind my zoom here. I just know it. There it is. So there's all the files that are necessary, HTML and JavaScript. And if I was to drag that over my browser, you can see the whole thing taking effect. Not bad at all. Pretty good, in fact. And if you wanted to build a MOV file, like what I showed you at the start when I demonstrated what we were going to put together, that's as simple as going to File, Export, Export, Video, Media. And then in this dialog box that appears in a few moments, you choose the profile that you want to go with for exporting it. So, of course, I've gone for a preset here where I'm just matching the source at the top. But you could go and choose your social media ones, such as Facebook and Twitter from here. I'll match the source, and I'm just making it so that it lasts for 20 seconds here by entering a duration. It's remember what I last put in, which is why it's already set up perfectly. So I'll press export. And then this hands it over to this piece of software, Adobe Media Encoder. It does that automatically. It happens in the background. I'm going to get a message any moment now saying it's successfully made it. I'll press OK. This message, this output window can always look alarming, like you've made an error, but don't worry about that. That's just referring to how frames are numbered. So we'll go back to timeline there. So I could toggle output timeline. So there we go. There's the MP4, which is good. As I say, that plays perfectly. So I'll quit out for QuickTime and just pop that in my project folder. And so that was, I know it was a little bit quick that it had to be, because I really want to get in this other business of the infographic banner. So I'm going to close that off and just save it as it was. Close that one off as well. And if I go over to my folder where I put all this together, in folder 2, I've got this infographic, and at this time I've decided to make the animation occur across the root timeline. I think when you're learning the software, you tend to work in this manner, and don't get me wrong, there are occasions where there is a good call for it, but really you can see I've just made some layers here where I've got some tweens for the text flying in, and then I've got these symbols on the right hand side that have got their own timeline. So when I double click, I've got things like those little circles bouncing around and the hands overlapping, which compared with the last tutorial we just looked at is pretty simplistic. So it just does all of this, which is fine, no problem at all. You could leave it at that. And I think that quite a lot of these things you tend to see on the internet are pretty much like this, just simplistic. But I thought it'd be quite nice to show you how we can have a custom rig to finish off. And I can show you how I can have 2 characters walking across, like that initial movie I showed you, and just try and indicate a bit of social distancing visually rather than reading stuff on screen, rather than reading text. So this is how it works. I'm just going to minimize this, or close it off for the time being, that file. I'll minimize Animate, and in a separate folder, I've got my character that I've drawn in Adobe Illustrator. So I'll just show it to you in Illustrator. I've spent quite some time drawing these shapes, some of them very simplistic in Illustrator. And you can see it's all layer separated. Got my layers panel showing there. So I'm not gonna lie to you, this took quite some time to put together. And if you're wondering why the shape or the person is not all pulled together into a pose that you recognize, that's quite important, because it plays a big part when we bring it into Animate as to how the bounding box goes around the shapes. Unless they're kind of a perfect rectangle like that, you're going to have problems. What you don't want is this sort of thing where if it was on an angle, if I put that on an angle, and then the bounding box looks like, well, surrounding it like that, it's not the best yet demonstration. Let me just see if I can do this reset. That might help me explain. There we go. That's what you do not want. So we need to have the bounding box snug fitting. And I'll put that back now. I'll close this off. And again, I need to get to the most important aspects of this with the remaining time we've got. So if I just open up this file B in Animate, just to show you that you'd import it in the same way that we imported the Photoshop file earlier. And once you've imported it, you would then select everything and convert it to a movie clip. So in this instance, I've called it man import. And we know that if you double click, you've got the individual elements that you just saw a few moments ago. So that's easy enough. I'm going to close that one off. It's a bit Blue Peter fashion this now, I'm afraid, but I don't want to have you watch me spend ages pulling things around. So I've gone into the next one where it's been pulled together. Don't worry about it not quite looking right at the bottom. You'll see in a few moments why I've done that. I'm going to double click now. So all I've really done is compare with that last version. I've just kind of pulled everything into place using the free transform tool to rotate and position. So what happens next is this. I go over to my animation panel, just like we saw before. And this is not one of Adobe's own internal graphics. So what I can expect to see when I drag the walk rig over like this is it hasn't got the first clue what this graphic is. So it pulls up this rig mapping panel. And this is wonderful fun to play around with. So the idea is the first pinpoint is always the hip. And I know it looks like the torso of the body, but it really isn't. When you click on it, it's just this small little graphic I've done here that kind of connects the bottom of the torso to the legs, and that's the most important point. So when you click on the pinpoint that you're interested in and then click, it maps it. You can see when you roll over it highlights it, and then you can do all the other points. The chest is shown as really small, but that's your chest. And this is great fun to do, absolutely, and like that. So just clicking on the appropriate pin and mapping it like that. This is in beta release at the moment, so it's going to improve dramatically. Not that there's, to my mind, anything wrong with it. It works rather well. So again, just clicking on the appropriate pins, nearly there now. So what's great is as you kind of roll over the pins, like I say, it's just highlighting on screen. So, so you can do that as a sort of, if you like, double check that you've got everything correct. And I'm about to press this apply skeleton button that will make it walk. But I like to then, before I do that, just select all of these elements, including this sort of hip area, and push that up a bit so it just looks a little bit more natural. Then I press apply skeleton, and I've got that. And you can see there's certain areas that aren't quite right, because again, these rigs are more meant for the internal graphics. So you can go over to the free transform tool and just maybe zoom in a little bit, but you can pull any areas that you're not happy in a bit for each of the black diamond keyframes. So just each black diamond keyframe, just pull it in and just correct it. It only takes a moment, like that. Which is good. Brilliant. And of course, if I just go back to scene 1 now, just using the breadcrumb, going back to scene 1. And if I just do a very quick command return, so you can see he's walking on the spot, which is fair enough. No problem at all. So I'll close that off. And copy in. I'm going to copy him. And I'm going to open up that last project that was a little bit dull to look at, the COVID one. So I'm going to make a new layer at the top and paste him like that, moving there. And then as if by magic, I've also done an alternative version of him. Inside here, I've done a copy of him, just changed the colors, and he's already got the walking in place. So same thing really, just with a different Adobe Illustrator file. So I'll copy that, jump over to here, where we're building this up, and do yet another layer and another paste, and put in there. And before I do anything, I just want to put some guides in place. So again, if you're familiar with Adobe software, you'll know that involves going into where the rulers are and just dragging these guides into position. Just pulling those so that the feet are on the bottom guide. Over to the free transform tool. If you hold down the Alt key and the Shift key, then it keeps the bottom corner in position and constrains your scale, which is useful to know anyway. Pulling that there, and that there. So I'll just deal with these one at a time. I'll just turn the eye off the top layer, and on this layer, I'm going to say Insert, Create Motion Tween. So I'm doing this again on the root timeline. Pull the playhead over to the right-hand side and drag him over, which is good. That's good. And it's we know that it's got internal motion. If you wanted to see both timelines together, the internal timeline and this tweening timeline, there's nothing stopping you going over to your properties panel and changing it from movie clip to graphic clip. So you can see the walking. So it doesn't really bother me either way. I know that it all compiles properly in the end, so I'll put it back as movie clip. And then I'll hide that layer and bring the other layer back. And of course, for this one, we need to add motion tween. And then this one's going to move all the way over to the left. And don't forget, it slides on this timeline, but it's got its own internal timeline where it's got the walking pose. So I'll turn the eyes back on for both. And what I'm trying to achieve is when they kind of meet somewhere around here, for both of them, I'm going to insert timeline keyframe. So I've got keyframes for both selected layers. And then as they kind of get closer together, first of all, for the top layer, so again, I'll just turn the eye off for the layer below it so I'm not confused which layer I'm operating on. Over to the free transform tool, and maybe I'll make him much bigger. And toggle the eyes, and for the next layer down, we'll make him much smaller. So we're getting there. Just turn the eye on for the one so you can see the illusion, which is good. And then when they get past each other, we'll bring the scale factors back up. And I don't need to play around with the eyes for this now. I can click on him and scale him down, and click on him and scale him up. So you can see it's planting these property keyframes when I'm working directly on the graphics. So I'm getting that kind of overall effect, which is exactly what I want. And there we go. If I do command return, back on the infographic with a nice effect. Well, fantastic. That's gone quite well by and large. It was only that little thing right at the very start with the plane, which is always to be expected. I suppose something's going to go slightly awry, but I hope you enjoyed that.